A great pleasure to host today this wonderful talk by Anna de Fina, whom I would like to warmly welcome and also to thank for her kindness, her availability, and her readiness to give this very interesting talk. The main goal or the central task of the Center for Italian Studies at Freie Universität Berlin would be to create and to develop academic contacts between, on the one hand, the universities and institutions in the Berlin-Brandenburg area, like Freie Universität, Humboldt-Universität, the Technical University of Berlin, and last not least, the University of Potsdam. And on the other hand, institutions and universities in Italy and generally abroad who are working on subjects and topics somehow related to Italy. So it is really always a special occasion and a very special pleasure to host events created and organized and also proposed, obviously, by our partner universities, in this case, the University of Potsdam, which is splendidly represented by Annette Gerstenberg, our dear colleague from Italian linguistics, and her colleague from Italian literature, Cornelia Kletke, in our scientific board. We have a great relationship with various corporations, and this will be one of the most interesting ones, I think, in a whole series of events we have organized together. So thank you, Annette Gerstenberg. Thank you, Marta Lupica Spagnolo, for organizing this. This would be all from my part. Please don't consider me impolite if I turn off my webcam, but we are in a homeschooling situation here, and I have 3 kids involved in various video conferences, and I really would like to avoid a complete breakdown of our internet here at home. But I'm following, obviously, all which is about to be said right now. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Marta Lupica Spagnolo, and I work as a postdoc for Roman Studies at the University of Potsdam. Today, I'm very glad for the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Anna de Fina. First of all, I would like to thank you all very much for being here. The audience, colleagues, the general public, and above all, the students who are virtually with us this afternoon. I would also like to thank the Forum of the Freie Universität Berlin, and in particular, Sabine Greiner, for her very kind and productive cooperation in organizing this lecture, as well as Jana Reusch, who is going to help us today if there are any technical problems. Lastly, I deeply thank our guest speaker, Anna de Fina, who accepted our invitation to give an online talk on narrative analysis, a very interesting and also important field of research, which, among others, is helping us to better understand how individuals give meaning to their own and other experiences, being influenced by, but also resisting against, dominant ideologies and asymmetrical power relationships. Currently a professor of Italian language and linguistics and chair of the Italian department at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., United States. After studying in Palermo and at Cambridge University, she received a PhD in linguistics from Georgetown University, where she has been teaching and doing research since 2004. The Fina research interests range from narrative and discourse analysis to the study of identity co-construction in interviews to linguistic superdiversity and sociolinguistics of migration and transnational communities. In her work, she often focuses on minority language groups, such as undocumented Mexican immigrants, in particular women in the United States, Italian-speaking communities abroad, and more recently, minor asylum seekers in Palermo. As for her research on storytelling, her expertise focuses on theoretical and methodological issues, such as the definition of a narratives as practices approach in doing storytelling analysis, which we will also discuss today, And furthermore, she pioneered researches on non-prototypical stories and new narrative genres, such as stories in social, for instance, on Twitter. Among her several publications, we can mention 2 volumes, both of which she co-authored with Alessandra Georgakpopoulou, Analyzing Narrative, Discourse and Sociolinguistic Perspectives, published in 2012, and the Cambridge Handbook of Discourse Studies, published in September 2020. Today, Anna De Fina will give a talk titled Methodology. I welcome you again. Looking forward to listen to your presentation.
Can you hear me? Just go like this if you can hear. Okay. All right. Anything that happens, just let me know. Okay. So first of all, let me thank you, Marta, for the invitation, and let me thank the Italian Centrum and the University of Potsdam, specifically Sabine Greiner, who's been very helpful and who's also coordinating this event with you. And I want to thank Dr. Hub also, who just introduced us. So thanks everybody for being here. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to you. It's morning here. So as you can read from the title, I'll talk about narrative as a research methodology. Here is a summary of the talk. So first of all, I'll talk about narrative studies in general, some very, very general trends and typologies. Then I'll discuss the Labovian narrative model, which has been dominant until, I would say, the 90s. And I will then focus on what I call post-Labovian approaches, that is, both biographical and interactionist approaches. Then I'll devote a little bit of attention to my own approach, which I call narratives as practices. And then I'll discuss one example of how I see that approach concretely. I will discuss a story that went viral on Twitter. And then we'll end up with the reflection and conclusions. You're welcome to start writing your questions during my talk, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to discuss them. So Mischler makes a distinction between different types of studies. He talked about, and I think his categorization is still very up to date. So he talks about studies that are focused on temporal ordering and reference. That is, studies that basically focused on the content of the narratives, either the events being told or the experiences being reflected upon. Then he talks about studies that focus more on the coherence and structure and makeup of the story. So studies that focus on what properties make a narrative as opposed to other kinds of discourses or texts. And then studies that are centered more on the social functions of narratives in different contexts. So that they look at the social work or the interactional work that narratives do, and on the concrete effects that narratives have on social issues. Of course, there have been other typologies. For example, Jane Elliott talks about constructivist versus naturalist approaches, and by that she means naturalist is kind of looking at narrative more as a kind of container of content, and constructivist looking at narrative as constructing content. So, of course, these, as we will see, these foci are not necessarily exclusive of each other. Sometimes it's a question of, emphasizing one aspect rather than the other, not necessarily being exclusive of each other. So the differences in these approaches also determine differences in the kind of objects of analysis. For example, of course, The object can be the narrative itself as a text, or it can be the events, as we saw, or it can be the process of communicating, of storytelling. And in very general terms, you can have qualitative, experimental, or eclectic methodologies. That is, qualitative are usually focused on small samples and emphasize ethnography, participant observation, the discovery of units of analysis. We'll talk about this later again. And then you have experimental studies. Those are very common, for example, in cognitive approaches to narrative, where you have, controlled environments. Often we have, the typical structure of an experiment, hypothesis testing, and so on. And then we have the eclectic studies that take both, quantitative and qualitative methodologies. Among the most recent quantitative, we have, for example, studies that are based on corpus linguistics. So some narrative studies utilize both, for example, interviews and the corpus linguistics. So there is a much more mixed method use today than there used to be in the past. So, of course, the methods of data collections are very different. Some people elicit stories, for example, in interview or focus group. Other people study spontaneous narratives. Other people study both. So you have both situations where the research is independent, the context is independent of the research, for example, conversations, for example, digital data, and context where, like experimental, but also interview, where the context is controlled by the researcher. So as you can see, there are, and also types of data can be very different in narrative research. You have people studying oral narratives. You have many people studying written or digital narratives, sometimes that are very often a mix between written and other modes. So multimodal narratives also can be the data. And again, the analysis follows what we said before. You can focus. Some people focus on language, on style. How are people narrating? What are the modes and the styles of narration? Some people, as we said, focus more on what are they talking about, what story world are they evoking, and some people focus on how do participants engage in those narrative practices. How is turn taking? Who's the co-teller? Are there more than one teller, etc.? And why is that happening? So as you see, this is a very wide field. So of course, I'm not going to try to be exhaustive. It would be impossible. I will focus, as I said, on the foundational models proposed by Labov and Valesky, and then refined by Labov. And then, as I said, I will refer basically to two main approaches after Labov. So I'm sorry to not be, not give you the full picture, but I think it would be almost impossible to give a full picture in a lecture. Okay, so why is Labov so foundational? Well, because he was maybe the first sociolinguist. Well, he's foundational for linguists and discourse analysts. He was the first linguist who really focused on narrative. He did, there are two important studies. One study he did in 1967 and published with Valesky, where he took examples taken from his interviews of narrators interacting with members of their group in his studies of English, variation in Martha's Vineyard, in New York, in Boston, and in Philadelphia. And there he was asking the question, what is the relationship between the sequence of events in the narrative and the events in the world outside? And then how do we know whether we have a narrative or a fragment of talk? So he was trying to set up the principles that allow people to recognize a narrative. At the same time, he was very interested, and that's been an interest for Labov always, in establishing the relationship between that narrative and what happened in the outer world. So he later published another important study in 1972, in which he studied pre-adolescent, adolescent and adults in South Central Harlem in New York. And what he was interested in was the techniques used by African American youth to tell stories. So while his 67 model was more general, in 72 he focused on evaluation. And why was he so interested in narrative? Because in narrative evaluation, I'll explain later what evaluation is, but basically evaluation is the point of view, the expression of the point of view of the speaker. Well, he was interested in that because he was interested in demonstrating that the Black English vernacular culture had a tradition of skillfulness, an ability that wasn't recognized. And storytelling was one of the most important genres within that tradition. So he was moved by an interest in social justice, in inequality, and so on. And in fact, he ended up saying that, African American youth had an ability to tell narratives in a lively way that wasn't paralleled by their white coetaneous youth. So anyway, he elicited narratives through the famous danger of death question, which was, were you ever in a situation where you were in serious danger of being killed, where you said to yourself, this is it? And he felt that although he was eliciting these narratives, he felt that the genre of narrative was particularly important for him as a scholar who studies the vernacular, because he felt that narrators lost themselves in their narratives. They didn't pay attention to the way they spoke because of the emotional appeal of narratives, and particularly those kind of narratives about death and so on. So his definition of narrative was, narrative is one verbal technique for recapitulating past experience. In particular, a technique of constructing narrative units which match the temporal sequence of that experience. Again, as you see, he's worried about matching the external time and the external events with the narration. He's also pointed to the fact that narratives could be evaluative or referential. What does it mean? Referential were simply kind of summarizing events, while evaluative narratives have a lot of expression, emotion, and reflect the point of view of the teller or tellers. So here are the main elements that he saw characterizing narrative structure. So he talked about a summary. So something like, when you say something like, for example, oh, I almost died when I was 8 years old. That's a summary, it's an abstract of the story. An orientation section where the narrator tells about how, when, who, all the details that allow an understanding of the stories. A complicating action. So this is basically the backbone of a narrative. It tells you what happened. So it's a series of events leading to possibly a resolution. Resolution doesn't mean that the conflict was resolved, but simply that the conflict ended in some way or other. So resolution is a kind of complicating action. And the coda is a kind of a bridge between then and now. So something that the narrator says about how the story relates to now. For example, and I never went skiing again. I don't know, suppose you had an accident on skiing. That would be a coda. And then the evaluation is reflects the point of the story. Now, these are, at the same time, sections of the narrative in Labov's model and clauses of the narrative. So you can have a whole section of orientation, but you can also have one orientation clause. So the clause was the basic unit of analysis for Labov. So I'll show you here one of his stories, one story that Labov really loved, and he told it over and over again. It is actually pretty impressive. So the story says, oh, I was sitting at a table drinking, and this Norwegian sailor came over and kept giving me a bunch of junk about I was sitting with this woman, and everybody sitting at the table with me were my shipmates. So I just turned around and shoved him and told him, I said, go away. I don't even want to fool with you. And next thing I know, I'm lying on the floor, blood all over me. And the guy told me, he says, don't move your head. Your throat is cut. So this was one of the stories of this corpus, but you can see why it was, so interesting, because you don't expect that kind of ending at all. So here I also put exactly the way that Labov analyzed this story. So you can see that the first clause is an orientation, followed by a couple of action clauses, complicating action. Then another orientation, so I just turn around and everybody sitting at the table with me were my shipmates. Then a complicating action, another complicating action. Then here the reported speech is regarded as evaluation, but it's regarded as complicating action in the last clause. Your throat is cut, which is also reported dialogue. Labov classifies as a resolution. So I think that already looking at this, although we don't have time to go into details, but already you can see what kind of problems this model went through. You see that he's using a syntactic unit, which is the clause, to then kind of qualify functions of the narrative. And you see, for example, in the case of reported speech, how that doesn't work, because it's kind of contradictory to regard it as evaluation in one way, and then as a complicating action in another way. And so this is one of the main problems, the difficulty of applying a model which is evaluation. For example, we run into a host of problems qualifying evaluation as something separate because of the presence of so many evaluative devices in narratives, that it's very hard to distinguish evaluation from other functions. So the issues, these issues were amply debated and created a lot of difficulties for coders of this model, but also there were more, criticisms, further criticisms of Labov that were accumulating over the years. In particular, his neglect of context and his focus on the teller only. So the stories that Labov transcribed have no indication and no specification of what kind of context was there, what was the role of the interviewer, what did the interviewer say. So we have no coding procedure for coding the interviewer's interventions, for example, in the Labov's model. Plus, these narratives seem to have been told in a vacuum. So the other problem was that the fact that the Labov so closely defined narrative made him focus on the canonical story only. It was the canonical story, the story that follows all those steps, that although he did say that narratives didn't necessarily need to have all those components, but still the focus of narrative analysis was on these that were later called big stories or canonical stories. So the reactions at the same time in that period there was an expansion of narrative inquiry to the social sciences that also accelerated a kind of critique of Labov and amplified the fields in which narratives were used and the kind of narratives analyzed. So that period in the 90s is being called the narrative turn, and I think to a certain extent this narrative turn is still alive today. So epistemologically, the narrative turn implied the study of the nature and the grounds of knowledge. So narrative as a form of knowledge. But it also, in this period, the narrative was used as a method of analysis, as a tool of analysis. So narratives were widely used to analyze the way participants viewed certain social issues, for example, illness or social exploitation or migration or divorce, issues that were seen by people as important experiences in their lives. And there was, again, in this movement, a strong faith in the power of storytelling for eliciting people's knowledge, local knowledge, and understanding of social phenomena, and therefore of narrative as a tool for analyzing these perceptions. That also brought a certain attention of social scientists to discourse, since storytelling is a form of discourse, and since that's the way that we can study, of course, through narrative, these perceptions, these ideas, these constructions. There are two, as I said, two approaches that I think are important post-Labov. One is the biographical life stories approach, and the second one is the interactionist approach, what I call the interactionist approach. So the biographical and life stories approach makes a link between expression and development of personal identities and storytelling. So there's a very, very close link established there between expressing your identity and telling your story. The life stories are mostly told in interviews, and exactly, many of them are life stories, and they focus on personal development. The interactionist camp is more composite. You had CA, conversational analysis analysts, doing narrative analysis, and we will see how important they were for current developments. You have what was called a dimensional approach by Ox and Capps, the small stories movement by my friend Alexandra Georgakpopoulou, and the narrative as practices, which I think we thought about together, but then I developed from a kind of a different perspective. Okay, so we will go through these ideas a little more in detail. So why was I talking about the narrative turn? Because most of the people, the representatives of the biographical approaches, are also representatives of the narrative turn. So as I said, they focus on life stories, or at least on stories of landmark events. So some biographical analysts ask people, tell me your life story, and some of them ask them to tell about certain specific events in their life. So as I said, these stories are elicited. There is in these approaches the assumption that there is a truth teller behind these accounts that waits to be discovered. And as you can see in these quotes by McAdams and Brunner, McAdams says, identity is a life story is a personal myth that an individual begins working on in late adolescence and young adulthood in order to provide his or her life with a purpose. Brunner, in the end, we become the autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our lives. So there is a project of studying the mechanism of storing oneself, and that project is oriented towards coherence and authenticity, as you can see from the quotes. And the consequence is also that there are many of the biographical narrative analysts who think of, in a way, coherence in narrative as a reflection of coherence in life. So that if you can tell a good narrative, then you can see your life in a more positive way, more coherent way. So there is, of course, a privilege in storytelling of autonomy, of integration, of consistency, of coherence, against the idea of fragmentation, and also against the idea of co-construction, relationality, etc. Of course, I am being extreme. There's a lot in between, but I need to do this in order for you to see the differences between different approaches. So one thing that Schumann said, Schumann has been a big champion of what she calls telling rights. So studying how people acquire the right or not to tell a story. And she says, the biggest challenge to the study of personal experience narrative continues to be to avoid the conflation of experience with the authentic and the real. So that's one point that not only Schumann, but many other people have talked about, the fact that this idea that there is a real narrator behind the story, ready to be discovered, that this narrator has a coherent story to tell, etc. Okay, at the opposite end, also from the 90s, but even earlier, because Sachs, who was one of the most important people in CA to write about narratives, wrote in the 70s. But still, this CA movement maybe gathered some strength in the 80s as a movement opposing Labovian approaches to narrative. Basically, they refused to see narrative as a separate text. They saw narrative as embedded, not freestanding, so not detachable from the interaction in which it happened. So they insisted on the fact that storytelling is always sequentially managed and unfolds online. What does sequentially managed mean? That it doesn't come out of the blue, but it's introduced in some way, uptaken, so people may or may not accept it, and developed and closed. So they said, even in any circumstance, you have to, of course, they were studying conversational narratives. You have to expect narratives, first of all, to be jointly drafted or co-authored. That is, participants are involved in listening and reacting to a story. And they focus very much to show that work, that conversational work, they focus very much on openings and closings. So how were stories opened? How were they closed? So paying attention to this local occasioning, what does local occasioning mean? That they try to, precisely by looking at the opening, they try to see how is a story brought to be relevant, for example, in a conversation. What occasions a storytelling? It could be something that is said, but it could also be something that is in the environment, or sometimes there is no immediate local occasion other than what the teller says, but the teller has to work to introduce that story. So by studying that, they shed light on how stories are prefaced, how speakers display the relationship between a story and prior talk so that they can propose the appropriateness of its telling. So how do they make it relevant? How they can be followed up by other related stories that function as second stories. So a lot of time you tell a story, you get a second story, which is related, or a series of them. And so also how the participation framework can shape a story structure. We will talk again about the participation framework, but basically the participation framework has to do with who is listening, who is telling, how are people distributing their listening? Is there a principal, addressee? Are there overhearers, and so on? So all of that is important to how the story develops. Another important model in the history of interactionist approaches is Oxenkapp's model that they developed in 2011. They focus on stories as emergent products. They said stories are not finished. A lot of times they are developed and developing. So they propose to look at them according to different dimensions rather than traits. These dimensions you can see in the models are tellership, tellability, embeddedness, linearity, and moral stance. So they said every story can have a different scale and on a specific dimension. For example, tellership can go from one teller monological story to multiple active tellers, for example, in a family telling. It can be high or low tellable. So the high tellable stories about accident, earthquakes, ghosts, are in many cultures are highly tellable. Low tellable stories, the stories that we tell to our friends that may be highly tellable for that group, but they're not, generally very tellable. Embeddedness, you have stories that you can literally transcribe and lift out without too much problem, or stories that are highly embedded into the conversation or the environment. Of course, here everybody was talking about oral stories. We will see now that this has been completely changed by the advent of digital technologies. Linearity, are these stories developing in a linear fashion temporally or causally, or are they all over the place? And is there a moral stance? Is the teller developing a moral point of view, a coherent one or not? So Oxenkapp's pointed to the fact that you can have different degrees of each of these dimensions in stories, and which will make the story look very different from each other. Okay, important break with all of this was this small stories movement started by Alexander Georgakpopoulou, who said, okay, we should not look only at canonical stories. There is a gamut of stories that have not been studied. And of course, by then, there have been studies on generic narratives, on accounts, on all kinds of types of stories. But Alexandra pointed to things like what she called breaking news, for example. So narratives that are told in the spur of the moment, that reflect small, but not in the sense of duration, but simply the everyday events and projections, stories that are not told, but are only summarized, etc. So here you see some examples, references, promises to tell, etc. She said that these stories were underrepresented, and that they were actually most, that this umbrella term could cover most of the the stories that we tell. And actually, the idea of smallness is not necessarily, as I said, referred to length, but more to the fact that they're not canonical stories. And of course, these there was a lot of attention in her work on social media and digital stories in general. So sharing was a central idea in the development of the small stories. Although small stories have been applied also to other areas, but I think the bulk of the work, at least by Alexandra, is on digital stories. And also, lately she studied the interconnection between affordances and the agency of participants. So, what can participants do? How do they push for changes in the social media, etc.? So, this movement has been very important, I think, to break up with the past. Although I think it has also created a little bit of a polarity between the small and the big, where there's a lot in between. So my own approach, I call narratives as practices. The antecedent is in an article that we wrote in 2008, where we talked about social interaction approach. At the time we called it. So an attempt to synthesize the local occasioning of narratives in conversations with their role in a variety of macro processes, such as the sanction of modes of knowledge, accumulation and transmission, the exclusion and inclusion of social groups, the enactments of institutional routines, the perpetration of social roles. In this process of synthesis, narratives take different shapes and generic forms that are intimately related to those processes and practices that constitute them. Thus, a major task of narrative analysis for us, we said, is to unravel and account for the ways in which storytelling reflects and shapes these different levels of context. So my focus has been precisely this, trying to bridge different levels of context in storytelling and bringing in also a little bit more an interest in the historical side. So the link between the present and the past, the different scales in the storytelling, in the functions of storytelling. So what do I mean by practice? Well, as Wenger says, the concept of practice connotes doing, but not just doing in and of itself. It's doing in a historical and social context. That's what I was talking about. That gives structure and meaning to what we do. In that sense, practice is always social practice. So, as in many other interactionist approaches, there is a rejection of abstract model. The idea of what I call the from the bottom up principle, that is the idea of starting from nose to data rather than the other way around. And the idea of the principle that I call the wholeness of the narrative event, that is, narrative is made of certain condition of production, of reception, or of uptake. So who tells the story? How is the story produced? How is the story received? Is it received? Is there any uptake? Also, what kind of embedding of the story or stories is within other practices? What's the materiality of that story or those stories? What kind of modes are put in place? And finally, what kind of connections are established? So these connections can be horizontal, that is a connection between at the level of the event that we're looking at, but they can be also vertical. For example, relate to the past, as when people bring in chronotopes, bring in images and models of past events or past worlds in their stories, making them relevant today. So the focus is on the importance of embedding stories in different contexts, and the study of social functions of stories beyond the local context. The also pointing to the existence of multiplicity of story genres. So not only small or big stories, but argumentative narratives, generic narratives, accounts, hypothetical stories. And also the storytelling seen as a practice where participants and processes have their own criteria. So the implication of that is that the embedding of narratives requires attention to different media and affordances, consideration of participant frameworks, that's, as we will see in my example, is very important, and of production formats, that is the way that the authorship side of stories, and also, as I said, focus on different scales. And finally, in the case that we are doing narratives in interview or narratives in research context, a big focus on reflexivity. What are we doing as researchers? What is the researching context like? What are the relationships between researchers and researched, etc.? This is all part, I think, of what we call a storytelling context. So what are the tools that have been used by interactionists? Well, to study interactional management, so how stories are managed, we have all the tools coming from the conversational analysis. So what kind of sequentiality is developed? Is there audience design? Well, there's always some kind of audience design. And how is the audience participating? We have positioning, the study of how the narrator establishes relationships with the storytelling world and beyond the storytelling world, and with the story world as well. We have chronotopes, the study of spatiotemporal and identity nexi that get specified and elaborated in specific stories. We have the study of production reception formats following Goffman. We have linguistic analysis, for example, things like deixis, pronouns, evaluative devices, and so on. And finally, we have tools from multimodal discourse analysis, so that allow us to look at gestures and to look at the way that visuals are embedded, for example, within particular practices. Topics. To study topics of stories, we have the analysis of evaluation sequences. We can look at repetition and emphasis. We can look at connections. How are connections established, for example, even in digital stories, through hashtags, through phrases that get repeated from one story to the other, etc. And finally, in terms of structure, again, we have non-genre that can be a point of reference. But we also have different practices that establish genre. So looking at them, we can see what the regularities are. And then we can also selectively use these models that exist, in the sense that we can adopt some of their definitions or some, if that helps. I think we can be pretty open to using whatever is useful for our research. So what are the common elements among interactionists? The rejection of the only focus on the canonical story, the consideration of the emergence as an important property of stories. So, of course, a rejection of a priori criteria for defining what a story is, and the analysis of the interactional context, of course. Okay, so finally, I will give you an example of one of the studies that I did with my colleague Brittany Toscano in 2019, which came out in 2019. We did it earlier, which is a study of the way that stories that go viral are, let's say, circulated. So our question was, what kinds of changes does the original story undergo when shared, reposted elsewhere? And how are the participation frameworks transformed through this process? So tellers and listeners and audiences, their relationships and their functions. So as the framework for us was, as I said, the storytelling as practices, but also the second wave studies of digital environment, of which Androsopoulos talks about. These studies, instead of highlighting the characteristics of digital environment as if they were homogeneous, focus on participants' practices. So ways in which narrators construct stories, ways in which the stories are shared, and ways in which audiences react, as well as the affordances and semiotic resources related to the use of different media. And then we also relied very much on, as I said, on Goffman's notion of participation framework. Particularly, we wanted to focus on the different production roles. For example, the author is the person that takes responsibility for whatever is the story. The animator is a simple voice of the story, it doesn't claim to be the author. The principal can be somebody who takes responsibility on behalf of somebody else for a story. For example, in the case of a politician, it could be the politician could be telling something on behalf of the nation, for example. And the figure, which is the character in a story. And in terms of reception format, we can think of participants who are addressed, non-addressed, participate actively or not, etc. So this is, in a way, it's a study of retelling, but retelling have been studied in linguistics in different ways. In the past, for example, Norick studied the stories told more than once. And then other authors studied, for example, the different renderings of the same story, but told to different audiences, or different reconstructions of the same story. Maybe the newest way of looking at retelling was proposed by Schifrin and by Wardham, who talked about actually retelling as reframing. So retelling a narrative as, in a way, changing its meaning, always changing its meaning, changing the way we look at that story. We also thought that an important concept when we look at retelling in digital environment is the idea of entextualization. Entextualization was proposed by Bauman and Briggs. We'll go back to this when we look at the data, as something as lifting a text out of a context and putting it into another context. So integrating and modifying the material in order to make it fit the new context. So according to Lepin and al., this is a very important idea, because we can investigate how social media participants, through extracting what she calls instances of culture, so language forms, textual or other semiotic material, in this case stories, and relocating them in their discourses and repertoire, perform also identities at the grassroots level of social media activities. So it's a tool that has been used, the idea of recontextualization, to also see how these processes of changing meaning also reflect certain kinds of identity work. So the story I'm focused on is a tweet, well, it's a series of tweets that were started in 2015 on August 23 by a user of Twitter called Kelly Keegan, who live tweeted the breakup of a couple on a plane. She started that, and then she got encouragement by her friends or her followers on Twitter. And over about 2 hours and 20 minutes, she broadcasted the whole couple's break up and conversation. She garnered thousands and thousands of shares after a few minutes and of likes on her feed. And she became, her story became viral within 24 hours. So how did she do that? This is the first tweet that she produced. So she says, this guy on the plane just broke up with his girlfriend and she's sobbing. And then proceeded to, through tweets, mostly lines of dialogue to tell whatever was happening. So she called the man guy and the girl, and she reproduced what they were saying most of the time. Things like, is this really a surprise? Are you seriously surprised at this information? Oh, great, just great. I'm so glad I paid $40 extra to be on this fucking flight with you. And here you can see how she gone, and she was using, for example, capital letters to enhance emotions and so on. So what we looked at was how a series of platforms, we just chose the first 15 voices that came out on Google, of platforms that had reproduced this story that, of course, were hundreds, but we couldn't analyze hundreds, so we analyzed the first 15. And the outlets that we looked at were different kinds. So there were some digital platforms, there were some gossip sites, there were some more traditional social media platforms like Facebook or Storyfy. And there were some local and entertainment news, on the web. Only one of them was a video. All the others were written narratives. So what did we analyze? We analyzed what we call the thematic foci. What was the focus of the retelling? We analyzed the semiotic resources. What were they using? Were they using photographs or video or what? The production formats, how the authorship of the story was changed through this process. The use of affordances, that is, did these sites allow for example, for participation or not? And the reception format. So we looked at the comments, how many people participated, what did they say, etc. I don't think I will have the time to look at everything, but I'll give you a general sense. So we found what we call two thematic foci. One was the original story, the story world, what happened, okay? Who was right, who was wrong, etc. And then B was the meta story. What's the meta story? It was the story of the story. So that meta story was either Kelly as a Twitter user or the tweets and the tweeting process itself. So when the focus was on the meta story, if the focus was on Kelly, then there was some information. For example, there could have been information on how she became a celebrity, or evaluation of her as a teller. Does she make the story interesting? Is it a good performance? On the credibility, is her story true? On the legitimacy, does she have the right to tell that story? When the focus was on the process, then the focus was on how the story went viral, what happened to the story, to the tweeting itself. So as you see from this table, it's interesting to see that the only retelling that focused on the story was one. Okay, BuzzFeed talked about the protagonists and the conflict, etc. All the other outlets focused on some aspects of the meta story that I have been describing, either the tweets or Kelly or the tweeting. So However, an interesting thing is that this original story is kind of nested, often through direct inclusion of Kelly's tweets in these retellings. And all sites, of course, provide specific framings for interpreting these tweets. So let's look at the only article that focused on the story. Well, the fact that it focused on the story, you can see in the title, because the title talked about a guy alleged broke up with his girlfriend on a plane before it even took off. So we don't have, we see here that what was happening is the focus that the author told that one of the followers that the woman was crying and captured the attention of everybody on the plane, etc. And we also see that we makes a reference to the plot. So the plot being his focus of attention. So he says. He refers to the fact that the original tweet participant had talked about a certain Charlotte that was mentioned by the guy or the girl, and that had said, "Oh my God, scandal! Who is Charlotte?" So there is a focus on what was being told, on what was going on between the couple, and so on. That's why we can say that this story is focused on the story and not on the meta story. However, even here, the author does keep the tweeting process under the radar. So he says, it didn't take long for Keegan's coverage of the breakup to trend on Twitter. Fingers crossed, the poor girl ditched that guy as soon as they landed. So you see that is both at the end is also mentioning the tweeting becoming viral. So here we see that process of contextualization we were talking about, through which texts are lifted from the context and appear in another context. We can call this has been called the resemiotization, that is, so not only text, but more in general, the shift of meanings from one context to the other. In our case, we can say that there is a process of contextualization through nesting. That is, we have a meta story, as we said, a story, about the tweeting, about Kelly, but we also have the original story literally often embedded within the telling. So you can see, for example, here, the focus on the meta story. I'll go back to the idea of the nesting, but here, for example, the meta story has a kind of a morning after component. So when certain sources talk about this story, they also mention that then Kelly warns her new followers they won't be seeing live tweeting of reality dating on a regular basis. So we see that this is going already beyond the story that was tweeted, already to look at the morning after. Titles that focus on credibility or legitimacy, for example, why I refuse to believe it's real. One sources claims that it's impossible that this could have happened at that time because of the light or the darkness in the plane. I can't remember which one. Oh yeah, because the pitch black window. Another one says that maybe she wasn't in the U.S. Another title, in-flight entertainment or elaborate hoax. Again, is it true? Is it not true, etc. So what does this do to the production format? So you have an author of the story, which is Kelly, and then you have a producer of a meta story. And that producer can either disappear more or less behind Kelly or make himself or herself co-teller, or align against or for the original teller. So they can take up a lot of different roles. Sometimes, as I said, they can become co-tellers. For example, in the case of Storyfy, where the co-teller is telling what the tweet said and then says, clearly we're missing some details. For example, here you have a new authorial voice within the telling. Here you can see what I meant by nesting. So you have on the left, you have literally the story as it was told by Kelly. And on the right, you have a new story told by the author of this piece, who is interviewing Kelly Keegan about her present and future as a Twitter celebrity. So the two things literally go together. And the Stephanie Maida, who is the writer in this case, becomes a co-teller on the left and then alternative teller on the right. Okay, so she's telling the story in voicing the story as told by Kelly, and at the same time telling a new story about Kelly. Very quickly, here is an analysis of the comments. As you see, the comments are very more differentiated. So you have comments on the tail world, so on the characters, or comments adding a new story, or a story component, for example, something else that happened. Comments that invent a second story. And then many comments that align with the topics that we talked about: credibility, tellability, legitimacy. Then we have also photos, unrelated comments, etc. What's interesting about the comment, we found, here are some examples. I'm not going to go through them, but you can take a look at them. But anyway, what's interesting is that the comments usually, first of all, they're not allowed by all sides, and secondly, they often align with the way that the author of the article poses the question. So, for example, in the case of the comments to the mirror has few comments, but those comments follow the prompt. So the prompt was, one prompt was, have your say in the comments below, but the people followed the title of the article in their comments. So the title was "Woman Live Tweets Couples Break Up on Plane and is accused of humiliating them." So basically the comments follow that lead in the title. And also there are more than 1,000 answers to a poll. Was Kelly wrong to live tweet the couples break up? So you see how comments are conducted in a way by the emphasis of the authors. So to conclude, retellings involve a reflexive process through which the original story becomes embedded in a meta-story. The original story does not disappear, but is reframed through the co-teller's eyes using a physical embedding of the tweets and the photos. There is a transformation in the productive format so that we have the birth of new co-authors or authors. And the fact that there's so much focus is on the meta story, I think, is a confirmation of something I noticed in a previous study of audience reaction in social media. That is, there is a primacy of reflexivity. People are focused on the process of communicating and on who is communicating and how and why, rather than on the story itself. And then finally, I think this example explains or exemplifies the importance of the practice-based approach. We need to look at storytelling practices from the bottom up in order to understand how the participation culture and the new technologies have affected them, but also when we study other environments, I think it's very important to look at from the bottom up in order to understand how people organize storytelling and how they participate. Some current trends. I think a great deal of work is being done in identity construction still in interviews, but with the, as I said, with increasing mixed methods research, you have a lot of work on narrative in digital contexts and increasing. Some work on chronotopes, which is also increasing. However, less of a discussion of structure, which I think is a pity, because different stories have also different structures, and sometimes they are not, they are emerging structures, but they are there. There is an increased interest in precisely studying narratives across contexts. So how do stories circulate from one context to the other? But still little work on multimodal objects. You know, stories are multimodal objects. Surprisingly, we're still focusing very much on the written aspect or the oral aspects of stories, but not on the embedding of other media. And that's it. Question or doubts? I have my references and little messed up, but here they are. All right, thank you. I welcome questions.